Okay, welcome back from the break, everybody. And welcome to panel 2. First, let me just, as a quick reminder, mention that at the top of the back of your program today are the instructions to submit a question for the panel. And we're also taking questions from those viewing online today. And I'll be receiving those up here on my iPad. So if you have a question, feel free to email it in. Let me do a quick introduction of our panel again so you understand who's up here on stage. First of all, we have Mike Haynie, who's the Vice Chancellor of Syracuse University. He's responsible for Veterans and Military Affairs there. He's obviously our partner in this work, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. We've got Dan Goldenberg, the Executive Director of the Call of Duty Endowment. Michael Blecker, Executive Director of Swords to Plowshares, one of the 25 organizations that participated in our research this year. Ken Berger, President and CEO of Charity Navigator. And Louis Runnion, Senior Vice President for Public Policy and Director of Military Affairs at Bank of America. So thank you all for being here. Thank you. So I'm going to start with Mike Haynie and our partner at IVMF to talk a little bit more. Miguel mentioned earlier in his remarks the research and the toolkits we're putting out today. So Mike, can you talk a little bit about the research and specifically about the toolkits, one for nonprofits and one for funders, how that research today led to the design of those toolkits and what we're releasing?
Sure, I think it's important to understand a little bit of the journey, if you will, that we've been on now for almost 2 years, I think. And it really all can be framed around a question that Miguel Howe shared with me that President Bush asked early on in this work, and that is, what does good look like from the perspective of a stakeholder to this community, whether it be a veteran, a funder, or a not-for-profit themselves? How do we know what good looks like? And I think there's a little bit of a trap you can easily fall into when answering those kinds of questions about organizations. That trap being that you jump right to organizational attributes and metrics. And we were very careful, I think, not to fall into that trap, and that where we should start answering a question like that is from the perspective of who is being served, the veteran, their family. And so, almost 2 years ago, we set about a research project really trying to get our arms around the whole of what we knew. I would probably describe it as one of the broadest and at the same time deepest efforts to really understand the post-9/11 veteran and their family as a cohort, looking across a discrete set of issue areas: education, employment, homelessness, wellness, family, specific issues impacting female veterans, et cetera. And we brought together all of the research that's been done focused on this community across those issues. And what we were looking for is not just to aggregate sort of themes, finding, and insights, if you will, for each one of those areas, but also acknowledging that this idea of transition from military to civilian life is a whole of the person process. Really, the gold we were mining for, if you will, is what were those I think the phrase is typically red threads, but since I'm from Syracuse, I'm going to say, what were those orange threads that we could pull across all of those sort of siloed issues there? If we could identify the common themes and antecedents to positively impacting that post-service life course, social, economic, wellness, and identify what those common themes were across those silos, we're a meaningful step towards really understanding how to answer that question. And we did that, and that work became the foundation then for what we're here to talk about today, because we then applied those common themes and insights into a model that included then traditional measures of organizational efficiency, effectiveness, et cetera, with the hypothesis being that above and beyond the traditional ways that we think about organizational effectiveness, if there is an inclusion or incorporation of these really veteran-serving, veteran-differentiating themes in the context of how these organizations do the work that they do, we're likely to see a marginal difference, a positive marginal difference in impact. And the idea then for these case studies was to go out and now test this hypothesis, to look at a cross-section of organizations serving veterans such that we can understand, for example, the extent to which social connectedness, one of those orange threads that the General mentioned earlier, that's one of those findings, the extent to which social connectedness is embedded in the service delivery, the organizational design, et cetera, of a veteran serving not-for-profit, regardless of what their mission is, whether it's employment or education, the extent to which there are means and measures to advance social connectedness, we'd likely see, the hypothesis was, greater and more enduring impact. And that's really the purpose of the case studies, but then the case studies informing these toolkits. And really, it was the difference between research and actionable research. The toolkits became a measure or a means for us to take those insights and findings and turn them into actionable tools for stakeholders in this community to help not only make their organizations better, but make their organizations more impactful in the context of executing on the mission.
Okay. So one of the things I should say too about these toolkits is it essentially looks at both those organizational sort of baseline criteria as well as these veteran differentiators.
Yes.
And it really outlines a series of questions for nonprofits and organizations to look at themselves and say, where am I addressing issues? Where am I potentially under-addressing an issue? Where do I have room to improve? So that was really the way that they were designed. Dan, let me turn to you. Call of Duty Endowment, you really look for effective nonprofits in the world of hiring. Talk a little bit about the criteria you've used and what lessons you've learned as you've done this work over the past several years.
Sure, happy to. I'm glad the elephant in the room of there being too many nonprofits in this space was revealed in the earlier discussion. It's a problem that the Call of Duty Endowment faced early on in a desire to maximize the good we could create for veterans by putting as many as possible and by funding the placement as many as possible into high quality jobs. But you look across the landscape and there's really a needle in a haystack problem, right? There's literally thousands of nonprofits, even just in the human services space, as was described earlier. So the question we had to solve for was, how do you find those needles in the haystack and turn them into spears? And for us, that was process. We brought in what is really a stripped down venture capital or venture philanthropy model of, let's have a vetting process. Let's have an investment theory on how we want to serve. Let's hold these nonprofits that are interested in getting funding from us up to the light, and let's see who passes it. And so eventually we developed this process that we call the Seal of Distinction in partnership with Deloitte. And it starts with an application process. It's pretty short and simple. It's about a page, very metrics focused, where we ask organizations about both their efficiency and their effectiveness, and also their alignment with our strategy, as was alluded to earlier, as being important to funders. And we whittle them down to the organizations that we see a great fit with, that can demonstrate impact, can demonstrate efficiency, and can demonstrate an ability to scale. And then our partner Deloitte goes in and spends anywhere between 2 and 5 days on site with these organizations doing a very deep dive to validate that. And I think that's really important. You have to have a process in place. And I'll even go a step further in saying that than the previous panel in saying that we need to winnow down these nonprofits. I mean, as a person who is a veteran who spent 10 years in the commercial sector, coming into this space, I was struck by the lack of market forces, the lack of creative destruction that you see in capitalism, where organizations that don't perform go away. Organizations that don't perform oftentimes are kept on life support system. It's not because they're not well-intentioned. There's incredible passion here. But the fact is, if we could concentrate all the resources being spent on the best organizations, we'd help a lot more veterans.
Mm-hmm. Good. Michael, so you were obviously one of our case studies. You're here, as I told you the other day, you're here representing the 45,000 nonprofits in the space, so no pressure. But you're not one of these new organizations. You've been around for a long time. Talk a little bit, we've heard a lot from the funder side about meeting their requirements and them really driving change, which is an important role for them to play. But talk about how as a nonprofit you've really done that, but also balanced it with serving veterans and performing your mission.
Well, you know, Swords has been around a long time, and essentially we're, you know, it's a big mission trying to address the wounds of war, and we've always recognized that. And so since day one, we've never been afraid of those we serve, vets helping vets. So we've been in the community where the greatest need is. And in San Francisco and urban area, it's been in low-income areas, in Tenderloin, and that's where we are, and have been, and will remain so. We don't have any security guards, we don't have any barriers to get in the way of our care and our service. So, you know, and to do this service, you know, you figure out what your community needs. First of all, you're part of the community, and then you figure out what they need. And if you're in the field, you find out what the needs are. And then you sort of pull together the resources to address them. Now, we know that public funding can't do everything, but if you want to, like, if somebody's in front of you and you want to, or you outreach somebody and get them in and start a relationship and you want to really help them, you got to have services to help them. You don't want to send them away somewhere, send them down. Every time you refer somebody out, you lose folks. You know, we have veterans, especially during, you know, from, you know, the Vietnam War, we learned a lot about how to take care of veterans when, you know, the country was not particularly, you know, when they were really shut down in terms of the needs of vets. They couldn't separate the war from the warrior. So we learned to depend on one another, sort of like medics in the field. And so we learned what you have to do. You have to fight for your services, but you have to have services for jobs. It was always been about jobs and getting folks back into school or training. It's always been about counseling, working with, establishing rapport. You can't just give somebody a brochure. You have to establish a relationship with someone. And over the years, we discovered so many vets didn't have independent housing. So we had to do housing. We did it because no one else was doing it. And some of the most innovative practices really occur at the community-based level, whether it was these stand-down functions. I mean, even post-traumatic stress. I remember there was no such thing as post-traumatic stress. It was post-Vietnam syndrome. And it was the community that discovered that our community, our brothers and sisters were dying in droves and killing themselves and living self-destructive lives, that we had to, you know, force the issue, which we did. We forced the mental health profession to recognize that there's a problem with combat trauma and got them to recognize, and then there are resources that come after that. But it's hard to do it just with private funding. You need the public resources. But as an, you know, you also, anyone that's delivered services to the government knows there's a thing called government forms, paperwork. You know, you can't just, you know, you can't just give somebody comes in and you just can't give them, start asking invasive questions, right? And start getting into them, giving them a 10-page form. So data itself is tricky when you're out there dealing with folks and you're like a medic out there, right? You're dealing with great need, but you have to build that rapport and develop that. So it's a balancing act. And it's also, I think, what's allowed us to sort of survive is we've gotten some multi-year grants. Because, you know, when you're trying to, we've had a lot of increases just in the last 4 years because we've done a lot of housing. And with housing comes a lot of personnel, a lot of responsibility, a lot of assets you have. You got to account for them. You have to have an HR department. You have to take care of your people who are out there, just like you should take care of your soldiers who are out there. So it comes, you know, we fortunately got some grants that allowed us and trusted us because they could, you know, we had delivered the goods and they trusted us to invest in us over multi-years. Because sometimes if you're doing the human service work every day, you don't have a lot of time to step back and figure out your data analysis or your perfect matrices, right? You have to sort of do the work. And so fortunately, over those years, we've developed that and added our infrastructure and tried to, it's a balancing act.
Mm-hmm. Ken, can you expand on that a little bit from a different angle? You obviously were a signatory to the overhead myth and talked a little bit about overhead versus programmatic expenses. We've talked a little bit about diversity of funding today. Mm-hmm. And Michael talked a little bit about, and some of the other panelists earlier talked about this need to be able to innovate while still providing program services. Talk about what you've seen in the nonprofit sector broadly and how you think it might apply in the space for this push for transparency while allowing innovation and service delivery.
Just as a footnote first, in the earlier session, they talked about the elephant in the room, and I just wanted to say that Charity Navigator's mission is to be a guide to intelligent giving, and basically one of the ways we do that is we speak out bluntly and plainly about the good, the bad, and the ugly in the nonprofit sector. So in essence, we ride that elephant all the time. So I've forewarned is forearmed. So basically, this overhead letter was created by Charity Navigator, GuideStar, and the BBB Wise Giving Alliance because we were concerned that there was an overemphasis on one metric, and that is overhead. It was mentioned before about the tax form and that the entirety of the nonprofit sector was being encapsulated and judged by overhead. And as a consequence, we decided to write a letter. And the first letter we wrote was to the donors of America, and it said, overhead is not the most important metric. The most important metric of all is the results of the work. And we need to move in a direction of thinking about that and focusing resources in that way. Overhead matters from Charity Navigator's perspective, but it's not the primary metric. So after we wrote that letter, it got a lot of success. There's a website, you can check it out, and a lot of nonprofits have used that letter with funders to try to move the needle on this notion of overhead. But at the same time, right after we wrote that letter, I said to my colleagues, if this is the only letter we write, we're in trouble. Because we run the danger of having every donor in America sit on their hands. And why is that? Because the vast majority of nonprofits, the vast majority, 90-something%, perhaps more, are currently incapable of meaningfully reporting on their results at all. And I don't blame the nonprofits for that, by the way. There's plenty of blame to go around. But the notion is, if we're telling donors, don't look at overhead, look at results, and the vast majority of nonprofits can't report on their results, we're in this terrible state. So we wrote a second letter. The second letter, which has not been as popular as the first, was a letter to the nonprofits of America. And essentially that letter says, there are 3 critical things that every nonprofit needs to have in place to function effectively, arguably, actually 4. One is, you've got to have strong fiscal management. Second is, you have to have strong independent governance. Third is, you have to have results that you measure and report on. And then the fourth is, you need to have capable leadership that brings all this together. I think of it in some ways as a tricycle. There's 2 little wheels in the back and 1 big wheel in the front. The 2 little wheels in the back are finance and governance. The big wheel in the front is results. And then you've got capable leadership riding that tricycle to get forward momentum. You need all of those things. And nonprofits have to do whatever it takes to get those things in place, to find the funding. I want to just say one last thing. We're planning to write a 3rd letter, maybe a 4th and a 5th. We want to write one to foundations, to government, and to other key stakeholders to say, hey, you keep telling the right message to the nonprofits when you say they've got to focus on results, but there's a problem. You've got to pay for it. And it doesn't cost the same as it does the way things have been in the past where we've counted activities. So measuring is the first step, but meaningful measurement of what matters most has to come next. And if you want the nonprofits to do that, you've got to fund that overhead. You've got to fund that infrastructure. You've got to provide them with training, because otherwise we're going to be sitting here 10, 20 years from now, and we'll be in the same pickle we are today, where the vast majority of nonprofits can't do this even if they want to.
Thank you. Louis, Bank of America's obviously made a lot of investments in the veteran space. Talk a little bit about your philosophy in this area and how you've approached the work.
Sure. Well, thanks. It's an honor to be here with all of you. So I'll talk a little bit first about the bank, and then secondly about our clients. And so the bank has been involved with veterans for over 90 years. We've had the good fortune to build some robust hiring programs and have hired about 7,000 veterans over the past 3 years. That's important to us. It's important to our culture. We've been a leader in the funding of the Military Service Initiative with the Bush Institute because we believe that the reach and the work that Miguel and your team is doing here, so we're excited about that. We look at things probably since 2008 a little bit differently now when we're asked to fund things. And I think in the past there was a lot of, all right, what's the marketing opportunity? And I can tell you when it comes to my team now, the marketing opportunity is great, and to my marketing colleagues watching online, I'm sorry, For what's most important to me is, okay, what's next? So what can we measure out of that? And that's what our team looks very closely at. And my colleague, Jeff Cathy, in the audience, and I and another look at how are we affecting that veteran population. That's our responsibility as veterans. It's our responsibility as good corporate citizens. So when foundations come to us or when not-for-profits come to us for funding, we want to see what the measured result is. It's not only important for us, but it's important for our clients. We recently did a survey of our clients and asked them how many of them would like to see their investments or a portion of their investments directed towards social, political, or environmental impact. 50% of our clients told us that they would like to see a portion of their investments directed to those causes. 60% of females said that, and 75% of millennials said that. So that's very important for our clients, and we understand that they'd like to see outcomes. That spurred us to think about some innovative ways to use finance to help measure some of these outcomes. And so one initiative that we've looked very closely at is pay for success financing. We've had some experience with this through prisoner recidivism, early childhood development, elder care. But the thought of applying this innovative idea of pay for success financing to the veteran space was important, and so we commissioned a study with our partners at Social Finance to look at the veteran space to measure how we could actually apply this. And for those of you who are interested about what is pay for success financing, it is innovative financing mechanisms designed to raise private capital to expand social and social service programs typically delivered by third-party organizations such as VSOs, NSOs, not-for-profits, which allow the government to repay the investor only for results. So these sorts of ideas have to have very robust data. Think about randomized control data. So when I go to the payer, whether it's the federal or the state or the local government, to say, what outcomes would you like to pay for, VA or DOD or Department of Labor? Are there not-for-profits that are delivering those outcomes, and how are they measuring? If those two things are combined, then we have the opportunity to build a vehicle to do these sorts of funding. So this is the study that we produced. It is released. I think you have a link of it on your website, and it's called Improving Outcomes for Veterans. We measured the space over 80 interviews with not-for-profits. What we found is there's not a lot of robust measurement going on, so we get a lot of outcome.
Amen.
Yep. So I'm not measuring elephants here, but if we're going to build, if we're going to use this particular mechanism to help fund effective interventions, we have to have effective measurements. So our commitment now is to, in this particular study, there are three things that came out of it that are promising to us. One is workforce development coupled with mental health treatment. The second is chronic disease and the intervention. And the third is women's homelessness. So our commitment now is to take the first of those, which is workforce development along with mental health intervention, and do a diligence to see if we can actually scale this to size, to find a government payer who would be interested in partnering with that. We do have a private payer who has agreed to work through us with the diligence process. That's the Wounded Warrior Project. They are paying for these sorts of outcomes now. So we're excited about the diligence process. Don't know where this is going to come out. Can't promise that we'll actually have a pay for success vehicle, but I can promise that we'll go through the mechanism to make sure that it is scalable.
Okay. So obviously one of the things you just hit on, and almost everyone said today, is that in general this sector needs to do a better job in reporting outcomes, being transparent about their work. Can you all, this is a question for anyone on the panel, get specific. Talk about where you've seen this work well, and if you want to name names, you can. And talk about where you've seen it really fall short. And there you don't have to name names, but you can be a bit more general. But dive in a little bit in terms of some of you who've really sort of looked at this issue.
I can start focusing on employment as an example. Every quarter I know how many placements every grantee of ours has made. I know what the average starting salary is for those placements. I know if they're in the job 6 months later. I know what the demographic of the placement is. Was this a post-9/11 vet or not? What industry, what function? And I would argue that if you're in the employment space and you can't answer those questions, you either need to be able to or you need to get out of the employment space. That's the expectation. Hire Heroes USA, heard from Brian Stan earlier today, is absolutely best in class at this. I could give Brian Stan a call, and I often do, any day of the week, and he can give me the latest numbers.
He can pull it up on his phone right now. He's doing it.
That's best in class. I think Mike will agree as well. There's another organization that's similarly great, Casey, Corporate America Sports U, that also has similar command of that. So, I mean, that's a standard everyone should aspire to in this space. I think, you know, in the future, there'll be probably some more forward-looking metrics, but there's also a cost of measurement, right? So I spent 5 years of my life helping corporations measure hard things to measure. And you always have to say, is the cost of measurement worth what you learn from it? So I think you begin with the end in mind when you're setting metrics. You say, what are we trying to accomplish as an organization? We don't try and measure 20 things. We measure the anywhere between 3 and 6 things that actually matter and will matter to the people providing the money, for instance, and to our operations to make us better. Those are probably the 2 biggest considerations. So,
just, you know, one thing about the measuring, sometimes nonprofits' reaction is, oh God, now we have to measure even more stuff. And part of the dilemma is that every funder seems to have a different set of requirements for what you report on. And so one of the challenges I think that we face is that we've got to get together and simplify the less important information and focus on what matters most. But it's a real challenge and a burden for the nonprofits the way it is today. And this could be perceived as yet another burden, and a very heavy burden, because to do it right can be a very rigorous process that requires creating a real rigorous performance management system within the organization. I think that the best in class, to answer the question, I mentioned before the tricycle. Another way to look at it is the beginning point to get on the road to doing what matters in your measurement and getting to the results that matter the most is with capable leadership. If you don't have leadership that has buy-in, that's data-driven and passionate about the mission being translated in that way, all the rest will not follow. So the leadership is key first, and I think we've heard some speakers today already that fit that model. Then the next step is to build the system and to do whatever it takes to build the system with all the obstacles that there are in funding currently to portion out the resources to do that, and then you can get to the middle point of high performance. Then the ultimate goal, the third step, if you can get to it, is impact. In our definition of impact as opposed to outcomes, it means you can rule out all other causation. And to do that, you need randomized controlled trials. Most nonprofits will never be able to get there. It's very expensive, but you can at least model your organization on the data that's out there. So that sort of is the stream. There is before the stream, before the capable leadership, there's the vast majority of the nonprofit sector that doesn't have the buy-in yet, that doesn't have the resources. And then there's one other box that I think we really have to mention. That's the people that are way over, far, far away from this. They're called the scoundrels and the thieves. And unfortunately, from our data, what we've seen when it comes to veterans organizations, tragically, there are more of these kind of scandalous, abusive, wasteful organizations than in many other parts of the nonprofit sector. It's a crisis, but it's also an opportunity. The reason, I think, is because the scoundrels and thieves, the scammers, the rip-off artists know that the American public is the most generous public in the world, that we have tremendous commitment and wanting to help those who have risked their lives for this country. And so there's a quick motivation to give, an emotional, impulsive motivation to give. And the abusers are taking advantage of that. And so the opportunity is that if we can call out those people vigorously, speak out against the thieves, there's resources there, there's an opportunity there that other types of nonprofits might not see, the outpouring of willingness and generosity. And I think with the additional education that's been talked about for the public, there could be even more of an outpouring. But we've got to call out those scoundrels and thieves and get rid of them.
Mike, do you want to call out any scoundrels and thieves? little bit, though.
I mean, I will say I can't overstate how important this particular conversation is. You know, we talk about market forces and creative destruction, and why haven't market forces come to bear on this particular space? This is why. This, you know, because 7 out of 10, you know, generically, this is, I'm not calling out scoundrels, but, you know, we're still at a place where throughput, number of veterans served, is probably the most common metric that we push out. You know, I will say to you, that is not a measure, unless it's a vaccination program, that's not a metric that's going to move us in a direction toward impact. But there's an interesting other question when you talk about who has to bear, because this will cost, but who has to bear that cost? I don't know that it's a foregone assumption or a conclusion that the not-for-profit themselves maybe has to bear that cost. You know, I think you can aggregate this conversation up a level such that as a community, we are bearing the cost of identifying what does good look like. You know, what are the metrics for different not-for-profit actors in this space, such that the standard setting, and it's, you know, we learned this from our research, when you look at other spaces that have grown up and evolved like this, when you talk about early childhood education or various health and wellness not-for-profit communities, largely you see standard setting happen as a consequence of major funders coming in and really driving performance-based evaluation, et cetera, across the actors in that particular space. That really hasn't happened in the veterans not-for-profit community in a way, and I'm talking about the big $100 million, $200 million a year kind of funders that exist in some of those other spaces. That hasn't happened in this space. We have lots and lots of funders funding lots and lots of different things, if you will, and as a consequence, we haven't really gotten to a place where we have good performance. We saw this across almost all. There were great organizations we looked at, but even the great ones ultimately, and they recognize this, I'm sure, could do better as it relates to really understanding how to answer that question. What's impact look like? And you know, I think maybe part of the call to this group, and this is why the work that's happening at the Bush Institute is so important, is as a community, rather than the burden of this falling to the individual not-for-profits, as a community, you know, we answer those questions, we set those standards.
Just one cautionary note on that, which is that would be a great place to start, but from everything that we've seen, the only time it works at the end of the day with the individual organizations is it cannot just be a toolkit, it cannot just be a list of resources or a portal. There has to be customized somebody has to handhold the organization to get it there. So that also has to be part of it as well.
Michael, can you talk a little bit about how Swords has done this over time? You've obviously seen sort of changing issues in the veteran landscape too. You've had to decide what you're going to tackle as part of your organization and where you're going to let others be the expert on that issue. So talk a little bit about how you've navigated it.
Well, again, you know, if you're a community-based organization, you let your community drive you those kind of decisions. You find out what the needs are. If a portion of your community is homeless and you try to do something about it, either you make sure the vets get their fair share of the housing resources in your community, and you can do it because you're a part of that community and so you advocate, or you do the housing yourself. You know, some of these main care services like finding vets jobs, right, or finding housing veterans, or helping vets with their disability and comp claims with the VA are very it's easy to measure those things. The thresholds are already there. Sometimes by the government and, you know, by the public service contracts, which puts an enormous burden on these small nonprofits, or even not so small nonprofits, to demonstrate accountability, to comply with all the requirements of reporting in these various contracts. Tremendous amount. I mean, if you want to make sure that 85 cents of every dollar goes directly to services, you have to have a good, lean organization But you can't do some of this mainstream care without that public support. But you can't be accountable that well to private support that allows you to develop the systems so you can measure this stuff. Sometimes it's hard to know what the funder really wants. What's that secret matrix they're looking for? It's easy to tell folks how many jobs you were able to get, the difference in the salary someone had before and after they saw you, or the difference you're making is how many times somebody went to emergency hospital, and after you intervened, they had less visits to emergency hospital, how many are still housed independently. That's pretty easy stuff. But when you're trying to make an impact on your policy, or you're trying to, even our combat to community, where we're trying to, because so few folks wear the uniform, we're trying to show the military culture so they understand the issues. They're not afraid of the issues. They understand what resources there are. How do you measure those kind of things can be a little difficult. But there are best practices you can use. But it is a burden for a nonprofit that's really operating in real time and seeing, 40 veterans every day who are dropping in, new vets, to sort of like make sure you're addressing that.
So do you have any, you've got an audience here made up of some funders. Do you have anything specific, you'd say to them as a? Well,
as an example, we did get one grant for $35,000 where we were supposed to improve our data collection, and $35,000, I'm sorry, we were able to hire a consultant that gave us some direction, but it required really implementing our changes. It required to maintain it. $35,000 did not allow us to sort of show how all those 4 big services interact effectively and give them the kind of, what they wanted to see was the impact of their dollar. And they wanted to demonstrate, we had to demonstrate to them how every decision was data-driven. Not so easy to do. We sort of know what we need to do. We're like a big part of the community. But to be able to demonstrate and to stop what we are doing to come up with this new arrangement to satisfy that funder, what are we doing? Who are we responsible for? What's our mission, right?
I would add, I appreciate the challenges that you have, and I think that I've heard that more than anything from not-for-profits in working on this Pay for Success project. But there are some good models out there, and if we're going to use this innovative process, we have to be able to measure what the government's going to pay for. So I encourage you to think about, look at other not-for-profits who are doing some of this stuff already, best practices. Right. Talk to organizations about perhaps, as you indicated, Mike, funding this data gathering project.
Mm-hmm. One other thing I could add is we've seen that there's an effort underway to really also try to get to the voice of veterans themselves, and I think you sort of alluded to that as well. Asking the veterans, getting the veterans' response, is this having the meaningful impact that I need in my life? And measuring that could be incredibly powerful. It doesn't have to be that expensive. There's some very innovative organizations out there that are doing work to try to aggregate that information, to share that information amongst nonprofits. So, we're happy to share that as well.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, 2 things just to add. I think, picking up on your last point, I've heard this refrain a number of times over the years, which is we need a Yelp for veteran nonprofits. We need an ability for our veterans to rate organizations, to crowdsource information on the quality of the services delivered to them. That's one side of the equation. Then the other side is from a funder perspective or an investor perspective, and I think investor is actually the right paradigm. Is there value? And I want to push back a little bit on some of these points. So I used to serve chief marketing officers in Fortune 500 companies. And 10 years ago, there was a real dilemma. A lot of money was being spent on marketing, but no one understood the impact it was having. And I saw lots of chief marketing officers at big companies wring their hands and say, this is too expensive, this is unmeasurable. I then got to meet with a Fortune 100 executive who had every measure that folks said was impossible to measure right there on his desktop, updated hourly. And what I learned from that was, almost anything can be measured if you're willing to put resources against it. And while it might be expensive or difficult at first, over time those costs always come down because the technology improves and the availability of data. So, I think what has to happen is a funder and a grantee have to come together and reconcile what matters to them both. And I think that the grantees have to push back when they don't understand why something's important or why it's taking too much effort, but it can be done.
That could be a scary conversation.
I don't know. I wish Brian was up here, but he's shaking his head. We don't think it is. It's a different space, but the conversation needs to be had. And
but
today,
it could be a scary conversation.
The post note to this is today that what I saw 10 years ago on that chief marketing officer's desktop that he was viewing is commonplace now across the Fortune 500.
Right. Good. We've got some questions coming in. Let me turn to one of them. The first one, everyone nods their head and agrees collaboration is needed but falls short on executing tasks to achieve it. How do we manage compliance and getting collaborators to actually deliver on their promises?
I'll speak from a funder's perspective. I think funders, Maureen Casey's here somewhere, every opportunity I get a chance to collaborate with Maureen, whether it's conversation, how can we help make the space better? As funders, how do we do a better job of helping collaboration? So if I'm seeing something that's working well in the employment space, I want to share that with my colleagues and with my fellow funders because, what's the saying, a rising tide floats all boats. So I think as funders, we have a responsibility to do our own collaboration. There's no secret sauce. I don't have anything hiding over here in the veteran space that I'm going to drop on JP Morgan tomorrow. I promise, Maureen. So let's do a better job of collaborating.
Okay.
I'd like to give a shout out to 3 organizations that are doing this very well. One, this guy sitting right next to me, I don't know if you're going to talk a little about NY Serves. I don't want to steal your thunder, but I think IVMF's done a wonderful job taking collaboration to the next level. I'm going to let you talk about that part, but it's a pretty cool story. Though it's early in the story, I think it's pretty neat. I think there are other examples like in Los Angeles, USC, CIR brought together 200 nonprofits in the area and got them to deconflict on a monthly basis, collaborate, cooperate. So there's models that way that are lower touch. And then there's a new organization out there called NAVSO, National Association of Veteran Servicing Organizations. They got organizations to come together and share best practices nationally. It's a pretty interesting organization and model, something we support. But I think there's a fundamental role here for funders to really drive that collaboration, in fact, build it into their grant agreements. It's something we've started to do to create incentives to cooperate across organizations. So I think there's some real concrete things we can do and help organizations that we fund set collaboration as a priority by tying them to funds.
Good. Mike, do you want to add anything to that? You were teed up on that topic.
No.
I stole your.
I mean, so this is the interesting contradiction. And again, if you get a chance to read the larger research paper that the Bush folks put out, I mean, we found this again in our research that, and impact is enhanced in instances where not-for-profits are collaborating with each other. But at the same time, we also found this tension that really pushed against collaboration, largely driven by the scrum for funding. And I think all the way back to Lewis's point, we overcome that if funders begin to collaborate with each other, I think. That's one of the, I'm not as optimistic that we overcome that at the individual community not-for-profit level because it's a hierarchy of needs issue. You know, they're every day it's about survival for a lot of these organizations, and if it can be perceived as I win, you lose, then we all lose. But I think funders can drive a lot of that collaboration by collaborating with each other and really pushing their fundees to collaborate as well.
So a lot of these organizations are small and are new. And this is a tough task for them, right, to think about how do they navigate all of this advice. So if there's one sort of smaller thing you would say for some of these really small nonprofits that are out there, what piece of advice would you give to them?
You start with me?
Anyone who wants to jump in.
Well, I would say that find a way, whatever it takes, to get to a point where you can measure what matters most so that you can truly know that you're meeting your mission. Look at things like beneficiary veterans feedback, constituent voice. Look at the models that are out there. Find a way, whatever it takes, to know that you're doing what you think you're doing. Learn and adapt and measure.
I think a lot of not-for-profits are founded on compassion or passion to serve, and that drives the early success. But you have to run them like a business. To Dan's point, you have to measure how you're attaining the results that you are. the story or the answer when I ask now can't be, well, we just get people jobs. That's great. But if you don't have what Brian Stan, or based on his socks, Pippi Longstockings has, the data that I'm in a safe spot, Dan. But Brian's a great example of someone who says, this is how we do it. This is our results, and this is how we're changing, and we're seeing the trend lines change.
So one of the questions came in that, Louis, is partly for you, but I'd ask potentially Michael to speak to this as well. Outside of just giving more money, what role can corporate America play to do more to help the nonprofit organizations that serve veterans?
Start.
Or Dan.
Sure.
Chime in.
You know, I think beyond just money, you know, it's a little, so let me put a little guilt on the funders here. I think I got a chance to sit in on a sort of grant-making 101 class in Southern California, and a number of large funders were out there presenting, and it was a great session, but I was surprised by how many of these large, experienced funders were really disinclined to ask for results or output, much less impact. They almost felt it was an imposition on the nonprofits they fund to do that. And I think in some ways, if it's not coordinated, it can be.
Yes.
But if you're not demanding impact, you're not doing your job. And corporations, you know, when they get into philanthropy, often, you know, it's a small part of what they do as an organization. It's something there's passion around, but they almost feel guilty asking for impact. And I think you got to get over it. And you got to ask for it, but also volunteer up your people and your expertise to help with that.
Well, and I'll build off that. Now you teed me up, and I said no before. Now I have come to believe that one of the beyond financial support, one of the most impactful things that corporate America can do is lend us your talent. Mm-hmm. You know, a great example for us is Accenture and Deloitte and Ernst & Young. For the better part of the last almost 2 years, they have been lending their team members to our various efforts full time to help us, for example, in New York City, develop performance assessment and evaluation models for not-for-profits serving veterans in New York City as part of this NYC Serves effort, and you know, lending their talent to this effort. You know, we've had team members from those companies that have been part of this research effort. There's so much human capital out there that exists in corporate America that can be brought to bear on solving some of these problems. And I think there's another avenue for the private sector to really step up is, you know, lend these organizations, these funders, et cetera, your talent.
Yeah, I would add to a comment you made earlier, so governance and finance. On the governance piece, how's your board structured? Is your board operating just like it would be a for-profit board, or is it really a group of friends together who share a similar passion as you, can get some things done? So are we operating the organization? And then the second would be financial accountability. Again, run it like a business. I appreciate it's your passion. This is my passion as well, but I still have things that I have to measure and report back.
And I say this with great respect for business, and I have an MBA, so I don't say this with disrespect, but I also think that there needs to be an understanding that the learning goes both ways. And there's sometimes a danger that the board is made up of business executives that assume that they have the knowledge to import on the nonprofit. You have some amazing, incredible leaders, incredible organizations that are well run. And there needs to be a learning that goes both ways, because there's a lot that the nonprofits can also teach business. So I just caution with that.
I think that's fair.
So Jacob talked a little bit about, you know, the reliance on tax forms is the sole piece of information we have, and that we need to get a better job telling stories. Talk a little bit about what you're doing and what you're seeing out there to help move just beyond the tax form as the source of information.
Well, when it comes to results and measuring outcomes and impact, I don't foresee any time in the near future that government is going to wade into that. Certainly the IRS at the moment is a little busy with other concerns. And so there have been a number of efforts from a number of different organizations to try to begin to find ways to help nonprofits to begin to report on that. There's one effort by the independent sector. GuideStar is also part of that now. Actually, I think GuideStar is leading it on something called Charting Impact, which is a place for nonprofits to report we're also encouraging nonprofits to put this information on their websites. So we're increasingly not just looking at the forms, we're looking at the website of the charity, because we think it's not about Charity Navigator, it's not about GuideStar, it's about all your stakeholders being transparent and accountable and reporting on that. Actually, there is a place on the 990 tax form that you could also put this information. It's in Part 3. You can voluntarily put that and put a link to it, but we really encourage those that do have this information, you should be proud. You should brag about it. You're the early adopters. You're the ones that all the others are going to want to try to follow, and you should really promote that information so we can all learn from you. And the same thing with funders. There's a tendency on the part of funders on occasion to do these reports and then hold them and oops, not share them publicly. It's really important for funders also, when you see these great models, brag about it. And if you want to cherry pick right now and only show the good stuff, have at it. Right now we need as much data as we can, so brag away. We need the early adopters to show this great information on the great work that's being done in measuring.
Good. So we got a question from General Corelli. He wants to know, what's the better metric, finding a homeless veteran a home or figuring out why he or she is homeless?
Well, you know, if somebody, you know, in combat, like had a trip flare and or a mine, tripped a mine, and they're lying there with the leg, you don't go over there and say, why did you do that? You take care of them. You don't worry about judging them. You take care of them if they're in need. And that's what I would suggest.
Yeah, Paul.
Dan?
Yeah, I'd just like to follow up with that. You know, a year ago I was here, and actually, General Corelli, you inspired me with a frustration you expressed, which was that when you were vice chief, you couldn't get the, I'm putting words in your mouth, but the DOD data embargo lifted, where DOD would share information on vets leaving the service with nonprofits in the area where they were moving to. And so I dug into that a lot more, and it's a widely shared frustration. I think data in general is a problem. You know, there's just such a paucity of it. Even the employment data, even the BOL employment data is sometimes of questionable value, certainly month to month. So we, across the board, need better metrics. I'd say, you know, if you held a gun to my head and made me choose between those metrics, well, at the high level, sure, we want to understand the root causes of why people are homeless, but we also need to know, you know, how are we doing getting them in home? So I think we need both. But, you know, the LA County Veterans Needs Study, for those who are not who've not been exposed to it, that's a great model for what we should be doing across this whole country, for understanding where real veterans' needs are and what the root cause of it. We don't have that data. We have horrible data. And, you know, it's something I'd like to see the VA especially get behind in getting us national data on what the real needs are. That USC study almost gets you veterans' needs down to the zip code, but it's only for LA County and now Orange County. So we need to make smarter decisions. We need to know, we need to have better information. Otherwise, we're sort of guessing, and that's what we've been doing for the last 14 years.
Mm-hmm. Mike, can I ask you one sort of final question? What was the most surprising thing you learned as part of this work over the past year, given IVMF's experience in this field?
That's a tough question, because this, you know, I've shared with Miguel and Holly and others. You know, I thought I had a pretty good handle on this space and what was going on, and this exercise, even for me, has been really insightful. I think there's a couple things I'll throw in there. One, I think we have to be very careful the pull of the status quo. One of the things that it's not the same environment today than it was 2 years ago, 4 years ago, 7 years ago. And not just from the perspective of these kinds of conversations and funding, but the profile of who we're serving is evolving and changing all of the time. There's more women represented in this particular community. The needs of various sub-cohorts of the post-9/11 veteran community are changing. And one of the things that we saw out there in the field is there really was a pull to that sort of founding model of service delivery and operation. This worked for me when I flipped on the light switch, and I'm sticking with it, you know, come hell or high water, if you will. And that's a dangerous thing. And I think that was one of the big insights for me. And then I think I underappreciated just how much the funder community drives behavior in this space. the extent to which, for example, back to the performance metrics, and the extent to which those existed, even in some of the most mature and sophisticated organizations, were almost correlated perfectly with what their funders were asking them to provide. And that serves a purpose on one hand, but it does not get to continuous improvement. It doesn't support necessarily innovation. And I think as you look at long-term prospects for veteran-serving organizations, that we need continuous improvement. We need innovation as a function of the changing nature of the population we're going to be serving.
So Michael, I'm going to give you the last word, given that you're the sole service provider for veterans sitting up here. What would you want to leave the audience with as part of this discussion, and what you want them to know about veterans in this, nonprofits in this space?
Well, I mean, I think, these kind of discussions are really important, and it lends tremendous credibility. As your nonprofit, it's really important to have credibility among, not just who you're serving, but the policymakers and those that fund you. And oftentimes it's really difficult to get your foot in the door. And sometimes funders can lend that credibility to the nonprofit sector dramatically, so that you can do even better work. I mean, oftentimes what you're trying to do is make sure that, in this case, veterans get their fair share of the resources they need to take care of their lives. And that can't be done just in the private sector. But the private sector and all the attention Sea of Goodwill has put tremendous scrutiny under the government, the VA, the State Department of Veteran Affairs. They've never been under this kind of scrutiny. What are you doing? How are you serving veterans? I think that's a very healthy thing, and that's only going to help really address this, this big problem we have.
Good. All right, let's thank our panel today.